Turn over with me tonight to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Of course, we're studying through the book of 2 Corinthians on Sunday evenings. And really this chapter and probably the next chapter deals with the subject or the main subject of giving. And so, Lord willing, probably next week, I haven't sit down mapped out the lesson itself, but kind of been looking ahead, and I don't know, we'll look at a lesson that probably revolves around some reasons for giving. But tonight we're going to talk about the giving that pleases God. And that's based upon the first 15 verses that are found here in chapter 8. Now, giving is one of those subjects that I kind of call, I guess I call them touchy subjects that you find within the pages of the Bible. And what I mean by that is it's a subject that can easily offend somebody. And the reason being is because when you start talking about things that are valuable, things that mean something to us, and you know, money is valuable in this world. It's something that does mean something to us. You have to have it to survive. We talk about things that are valuable to us, things that we care about. It's easy to offend people. But in the same breath, I think it's probably safe to say that none of us want to be known as a greedy individual. You know, we don't want people to look at us and say, well, that guy there, he's a miser. You know, he won't give a cent. Or he's a very selfish individual. So there's kind of a balance between the two whenever you think about what we should be and the type of giving that we should offer that is pleasing to God. It might be surprising to some people to learn that giving, at least that's what experts tell us. I've never sat down and actually counted out the number of times that it's found in the pages of the Bible. But they tell us that giving is a subject that's talked about more in the Word of God than any other biblical subject. And I assume that's the case, and if it be, what that indicates to us is that giving is something that's very important to God. And if something is very important to God, obviously it should be important to us too. A lot of times whenever we talk about giving in the New Testament, a statement is made, well, you know, no amount is specified in the New Testament as to what we are to give today. And that's a true statement. We've studied that idea before. But I think some people kind of misinterpret that to mean that the Bible doesn't have anything to say about our giving under New Testament law. There's no commandments that are given surrounding it. There's no considerations that are to be given to it. And that's the farthest thing from the truth when we sit down and we open God's Word. And so tonight I want us to think about the question, not the question, do you give? Because if I were to ask that, I'd probably say all of us would raise our hands and say, yeah, we give. But do we give in a way that pleases God? That's really what we want to think about tonight. And as Paul is writing 2 Corinthians chapter 8, he talks about actually the church at Macedonia, their example and how their giving had been pleasing to God. And we want to look at three things that made their giving pleasing to God. And obviously, if we incorporate that into our lives today, it will make our giving pleasing to God too. The first idea that we want to look at is if we want our giving to please God, then we need to be generous givers. As you look at these first 7 verses, you'll read about the church at Macedonia. And they were a church that Paul describes as being very liberal with their riches. Look at verses 1 and 2. He says, moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded under the riches of their liberality. He talks about how they were liberal with their riches. And liberal is one of those words, when we throw those around in the religious world today, we think, well, that's horrible, you know, if somebody is liberal. But it's used in a positive sense in the Bible when it comes to our giving. We're supposed to be liberal when it comes to giving to God and giving to other people. And Paul was proud. He was proud of the churches of Macedonia. In fact, as he's writing, remember he's writing here to the church at Corinth. He's telling them about these other churches throughout the region of Macedonia who were generously giving to God and giving to this cause, namely the collection for the poor saints who were at Jerusalem. And he uses them as an example for the church at Corinth. He says, think about this, you know, as you're giving. Look up to the north. Macedonia were the northern neighbors of the church of Corinth. And he says, look at their example. You might even say he uses them to challenge the church at Corinth to give generously just as they had. Now, it's interesting to learn, and Paul kind of points it out here in verse 2, there were great trials that were going on during those days in Macedonia. There was deep poverty that existed within that area. You know, the Romans had plundered that area, the area of Macedonia, pretty good. There was also severe famine that was going on at this particular time in that area. And so as you stopped and you looked at that area, you might think, well, you know, they couldn't give a whole lot. But yet Paul said they were very rich, they were very liberal when it came to their riches. And he wanted the church at Corinth to look at them and see, even though they weren't well off, that they were still able to give liberally, and that is, give a lot. And so if we want God to be pleased with our giving, we need to be liberal when it comes to our riches. The second idea that I want to point out is, it's entailed within giving generously, is give until it makes you think about it. If you notice in verse 3, here's what Paul says. He says, "For to their power I bear record, yea, and beyond their power, they were willing of themselves, praying us with much entreaty that we would receive the gift and take upon us the fellowship of the ministering to the saints." Notice verse 3. It's a very important verse. Paul says, according to their ability, and he says, I'm telling you, I'm bearing you record here, that according to their ability, and yes, even beyond their ability to give, they gave to us. And so he points out that they had given much more than he would have ever imagined them being able to give. Now I want to point out, Paul is of course writing this letter by inspiration, so they're not just his thoughts and his ideas, but they are the ideas of God. And so you have this concept beyond their ability, beyond their power that they gave. God is looking at their lives, and he's looking at the blessings that he's poured out upon them, and in his mind he has this, we might say this line that they're able to give. But even as God assessed their power and their ability to give, they went beyond that line, that ability that God had set for them. And so Paul was very proud of these people in the fact that they were giving beyond their ability and beyond their power. You know, I think about the idea of giving more than you can afford. And I don't know if that's the best language or not, but that's kind of what Paul's talking about here. And then think about us. When's the last time that we gave more than we could afford? Well, I generally say we probably haven't. We probably give maybe just what we can afford, or maybe even sometimes less than what we should be giving. But Paul was very proud of these people, and he was a little bit concerned. He thought they had given too much. But if you notice there in verse 4, they come to him and they beg him that they'll take this offering. Paul was a little apprehensive about taking this much from them, knowing the deep poverty that existed within that area. They went ahead and they besought him, they begged him or pleaded with him that he would take that he would take their offering, that they would be allowed to give it. I think about back in the Old Testament, a story that we find there. We've studied it before in the book of Exodus. I can only think of a number of times in the Bible where people gave beyond their ability, and this is one of them. In Exodus chapter 36 and verses 5 through 7, remember that whenever God gave Moses the blueprint for the tabernacle, that Moses asked the people to give an offering, a free will offering, to supply all the materials that were needed to construct that temple. And in Exodus 36 and beginning in verse 5, the elders come to Moses. They say, "The people bring much more than enough for the service of the work which the Lord commanded to make." And Moses gave commandment, and they caused it to be proclaimed throughout the camp, saying, "Let neither man nor woman make any more work for the offering of the sanctuary." So the people were restrained from bringing, for the stuff they had was sufficient for all the work to make it, and too much. You know, here you had a situation in the Old Testament where people were giving beyond their ability, beyond their power. And they gave so much that they actually had to command the people. Moses had to stand up in front of everybody and say, "Listen, don't bring anything else." Now, you think about that from the standpoint of the Lord's church today. And I know we're blessed in this congregation. We have very generous givers. I don't want to think anybody that I'm preaching straight at you, because I'm not. I'm preaching at all of us. But wouldn't it be great if within a congregation the elders had to stand up and say to the congregation, "You're giving too much. You know, we can't find ways to take care of all these funds, and so you got to hold back a little bit." Well, that was the situation there in Exodus chapter 36. But as Paul looked at the churches of Macedonia, that was also the situation there. They had given beyond their ability. And so I offer unto you the idea, if we don't even have to think about the amount that we're giving, if it's so little that it's not going to impact our lives, we might want to change the idea of giving generously, because generous givers have to think about the amount. Also notice in verse 5, give with a cause in mind. You know, Paul talks about in verse 5, that this they did, not as we had hoped, but first gave their own selves to the Lord and unto us by the will of God. You know, why was it that the churches of Macedonia were such generous givers, even at a very difficult time in their life? It wasn't because they desired the praise and the recognition of men. You know, they weren't looking to be acknowledged by any person, but they looked at it as giving to the cause of God. And when we start thinking about giving in that manner, you know, not just giving to a person or not just giving to an institution, but giving to the cause of the Lord. That's what they were all about, was giving things to the cause of God. Paul said the first thing that they did is they gave themselves. They gave their bodies and they gave their spirit to the cause of God. And so naturally, it was only natural for them to follow that course whenever it came to their funds too. They were all about giving to the Lord. They started with themselves. And as you go on and you read through the next couple of verses, you'll find that the church at Corinth was a church that was very blessed in a lot of different ways. Paul writes about all the blessings that God had poured out upon that congregation. And one of the ways that he mentions that they were very blessed is when it came to wealth. And so Paul is pleading with them to excel in giving like they've excelled in all these other gifts and abilities that God had given them, to give generously. So if we want our giving to be pleasing to God, we must be willing to give generously. The second thing that we need to do in order to have our giving be pleasing to God, I'm trying to go too fast here to get through all this tonight, we have to give lovingly. Look with me at verses 8 and 9. He says in verse 8, I speak not by commandment, but by occasion of the forwardness of others, to prove the sincerity of your love. You know, Paul is pointing out, I'm not just giving you a commandment in verse 8. You know, giving is not just doing something because God told us to do it. It's not giving because you feel obligated to do so because it's a commandment. It's not about giving out of a sense of obligation. You know, it's not just about being pleasing and fulfilling a commandment to God. And so Paul didn't want them to give just because God told them to do it. He didn't want them to feel that this was a burdensome or an obligated commandment. But he did want them to give. Notice how he puts it there in the last part of that verse, of verse 8, to prove the sincerity of your love. And so notice what he goes on to say in verse 9. He says, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that ye through his poverty might be rich. Paul used Jesus as an example when it comes to giving, not just out of necessity, not just because you're obligated, but because you genuinely care about someone and something. And so the thing, obviously the someone that Paul wanted them to care about was God. The something was the cause, the collection for the poor saints at Jerusalem that was being taken up. And of course, when you think about Christ, Christ is the ultimate example. Paul talks about how he was a very rich being. You know, we think about Jesus dwelling in heaven, having the nature of deity or God. He gave up those riches. What did he own? Well, he owned everything in heaven and earth. And yet he came down and he lived upon this earth. And as we studied on Wednesday nights a couple of weeks ago, he didn't even own a pillow. He didn't even own a house. There was nothing that he called his own except what was on his back. He didn't have a pantry. He didn't have any of those things that we would think of as necessities in the world in which we live. Though he was very rich, yet for our sakes he became poor. So why did Jesus give what he gave? Was it because he felt obligated to do that? Was it because of a sense of duty that he was willing to give up heaven and come to this earth? No, the Bible teaches us it was because he cared for us that he gave up what he did. It was because he loved us that he was willing to make that sacrifice for us. And so Jesus was rich, but he became poor so that we could be rich. What was the proof of his love for us? What was the proof of the sincerity of his offering or his gift? Well, it wasn't the words that he spoke. It wasn't just emotions or feelings that he had for us, but it was the actions that were carried out upon his part. And so we need to understand that it's important whenever we give. It's not just, giving is not just, words that we speak. It's not just emotions or feelings that we experience, but it's actions that are carried out by us. And so we need to give because we care. The third principle that he lays down in this passage, again, have to have this if our giving is to be pleasing to God, is God wants us to give equally. And he introduces this idea. Well, he doesn't actually introduce it. He talks a little bit about it back in verses 6 and 7. But it's this concept of finish what we start. And so he mentions there in verse 10 and 11, he says, "In this I give advice. It is to your advantage not only to be doing what you began and were desiring to do a year ago, but now you also must complete the doing of it. That as there was a readiness to desire it, so there also may be a completion out of what you have." Paul is talking about this idea of them finishing what they begin. And if you go back to verse 6, we'll not go back and reread all this, but if you go back and you'll look at it, what you'll find is he mentions that about a year ago, Titus came to them with this idea of this offering for the poor saints at Jerusalem. And so this offering, this collection, actually began a year ago. And as they're getting toward the end of it, Paul is making his round trip and he's picking up these contributions to take back to Judea. He's encouraging them, we might say, to finish strong. You look in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verses 1 and 2, you'll see this beginning of this offering. Paul says there, he says, "As I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God has prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come." So a year ago, he had given this commandment. And it's just natural for us, I think, as human beings, that when you first start something, you're excited about it. There's a lot of zeal, there's a lot of commitment. And so can you imagine the first offering that was taken up for the poor saints at Jerusalem? And then the next week, here's again, you're presented with this same ability. And I imagine there were people who were still excited about it and, probably gave the same amount that they gave the week before. But the more the opportunity arises, the zeal starts to diminish for what you're doing. And when you get kind of toward the end of the thing, you get kind of worn out and wore down, and maybe you're just not as excited and you're not really committed like you were before. And so Paul is encouraging them here, finish strong. Give like you gave the first time that whenever this was brought up a year ago. And so think about that idea whenever we give. We go throughout our lives here having the opportunity to give to God every first day of the week. Do we give like it's the first time we ever gave? Well, that could be good or bad depending on our financial situation and the things that we have in mind. But the point is we should have just as much zeal and just as much commitment and just as much desire to contribute to the work of the Lord as we did the first time. The second principle that we learn in these verses 10 through 15, is God expects us to give in proportion to what we have. Paul says in verse 12, he says, "For if there be first a willing mind, it is accepted according to that a man hath, and not according to that he hath not." A principle that's laid down throughout the scriptures. We'll probably talk about it more next week too, over in chapter 9 and verse 7. But the idea is to give in proportion to the blessings that God has given to us. And so what does God look at? How does he judge our giving? He looks at what he's given to us, and then he looks at what we've given to him. And he gauges our giving. He judges our giving, whatever proportion that we've given in based on what he's given us. You see that example in the story of the widow's mite in the New Testament. You see men who were casting in tremendous sums of money in the temple. And dollar amount, they were far more than what the widow cast in. But God judges in proportion to what we have. What did she have? She had the 2 copper coins, right? And what did she give? She gave everything. And so what God looks at when he judges, our giving is what he has given to us. What do we own? What do we possess? How much have we prospered during the week? And then how much do we give out or give back in proportion to that? I know sometimes it's just human nature, I guess, as we think about our commitment to giving to God. We may be going through a month where we're struggling. And maybe in our human minds we think, well, I can't give God very much this month because I need to pay all these bills, and this expense popped up here and I didn't think about it. And so maybe in our minds we think, well, I'm going to hold back a little bit this week. Or maybe we even think, well, I just can't afford to give anything to God this week. And so a lot of times what we do in our human minds is we try to justify this thinking. Here's one of the things we say to ourselves: but if I had $1 million, I'd give half of that to the Lord. I'd be committed. Well, think about that. God doesn't judge us in proportion to what we don't have. That's not what our giving is based upon. It's based upon what we do have. It's based upon what God has given to us. And so the question is not, what would we do if we had $1 million? The question is, what are we doing with what God has given us now? What kind of proportions are we giving in? And so Paul lays down this principle there. God doesn't judge our giving by what we don't have. God judges our giving by what we do have. Then the third and the last thing that I want to mention under this particular heading is, if we're going to give equally, we need to give with the idea of we're supplying a need. And Paul talks about this beginning in verse 13. He says, "For I mean not that other men should be eased and ye burdened, but in equality, that now at this time your abundance may supply, or may be a supply for their want, that their abundance also may be a supply for your want, that there may be equality. As it is written, he that hath gathered much had nothing over, and he that had gathered little had no lack." Well, we've already mentioned this idea how Judea had been hit with a severe famine. And so what was Paul talking about when he was talking about they were supplying a need? Well, Corinthian area was a very rich area. There wasn't the severe famine that they were experiencing in other places of the world. And so there was an abundance there. There was an ample supply there. And they were able to take from that abundance and that ample supply, and they were able to supply a need to somebody who was lacking. We think about the idea within the principle, or within the scriptures itself. And you see it, Paul talks about it used interchangeably. In the early church, the Jewish Christians, the Gentiles had a need, and that need was to hear the gospel preached. The Jewish Christians paid for that. They were the ones who sent out the missionaries into the world. They were the ones who helped pave the way. And so there was a need, and those funds, their giving was able to supply that need. And now as Paul is looking at the world from which he stands, he's seeing that in the Gentile churches there's a surplus, and in the Jewish churches there's something that is lacking. So the Jews gave to supply the needs of the Gentile churches. Now the Gentile churches can give to supply the needs of the Jewish churches. And he lays down this principle. It's an interesting statement in verse 15. He that had gathered much, he said, this is written, he that had gathered much had nothing over, and he that had gathered little had no lack. Well, if you're familiar with that story, you know what he's talking about is the manna that God gave the children of Israel in the wilderness. And remember, God sends down this manna from heaven, this food from heaven, and he wanted all of his people to eat, didn't he? He wanted everybody to be supplied with this food. And so what did the people do? They went out with baskets early in the morning before the sun came up and melted away this food, and they gathered up. Now remember that they were only supposed to keep a certain amount. Well, what did you do if you go out and you gathered up more than what you could keep? You looked for somebody who was lacking, somebody who maybe didn't have the physical ability to go out and gather for themselves, somebody who may not have been as quick or as strong as you, and you gave and you helped to supply a need. But they were used in the Old Testament, that principle. The person who gathered a lot didn't have anything left over because he had given it to those who were in need. The person who was lacking was full because the persons who had the surplus were giving to provide a need. And so you have this principle. Remember, there was a temptation in the minds of some people to think, well, we'll just selfishly keep it, right? We'll just keep it till tomorrow and then we'll have whatever we need. Well, what happened? It bred worms and it stunk, the Bible said. So there was no keeping it. There was no selfishly hoarding it up for yourself, but there was an equality. There was an opportunity to help those who had a need. And so that's exactly what Paul is talking about here. The church at Corinth had an opportunity to give and to supply a need. And if we think about giving from that perspective, we're supplying a need. We're helping those. We look at ourselves and we often think, well, we don't need anything. we're well off, we're good, but what about other people in the edges of the earth? What about other people in third world countries? Do they have a need that we can supply in our giving? Well, if we want to be pleasing to God, that's the idea that there is behind it, supplying a need. There's a type of giving that is pleasing to God, and there's a type of giving that is not pleasing to God. Again, the question is not, are we giving to God? The question is, are we giving in a way that is pleasing to God? What do we have to do to make our giving pleasing to God? We have to be generous givers. We have to be liberal with our riches. We have to give in a way that makes us think about what we're giving. We have to give with the cause of God in mind. We have to give lovingly. That means we're not just giving out of obligation or a sense of duty, but we're giving because we genuinely care about God, and we're proving the sincerity of the love that we have for our brothers and sisters in Christ and for our fellow man in our offering that we're giving. And then we have to give equally. That means we give just as strongly today as we did when we first started. That means we sit down and we look at the blessings that God has poured out upon us, and we give in proportion to those blessings that have been given to us. And then we give with the idea of helping others, supplying the need, because God has blessed us and been rich toward us so much. Maybe there's one here tonight that is not yet